In a small, serene city in Africa surrounded by lush greenery, there lived a widow named Mrs. Dan, a kind-hearted schoolteacher and philanthropist. She lived with her 6-year-old daughter, Sarah. Mrs. Dan was well known for her compassion, her dedication to education and her faith in God. While she didn't live in abundance, it never deterred her from doing good for the less privileged. Since her husband's death, she had worked hard to provide for her daughter and fund her charity work while teaching at the local school. During one of the holidays on a sunny afternoon, Mrs. Dan was busy reading while Sarah played with her doll. The door creaked open and a hesitant knock echoed through the room. "Come in," Mrs. Dan called out. The door slowly opened and a woman stepped in holding her son's hand. The woman looked worn out, her eyes filled with worry. Her son, an 8-year-old boy named Ken, clung timidly to her side, avoiding eye contact. "Good afternoon," the woman greeted, her voice soft but strained. "I'm Mrs. Paul. I've heard about you. I heard that you're a kind teacher who helps people a lot." Mrs. Dan smiled warmly, sensing the distress in the woman's demeanor. "Please, have a seat." Mrs. Paul hesitated before speaking again. "This is my son, Ken. He has a learning disability. Many schools have rejected him. Other children make fun of him, and I don't want him to go through that pain anymore." She choked on her words, tears welling up in her eyes. Mrs. Dan's heart sank. She knelt down in front of Ken, meeting his gaze. "Ken, you're welcome here," she said gently. "Every child is special in their own way, and we'll work together to help you learn." Ken looked at Mrs. Dan, his eyes filled with uncertainty but also a flicker of hope. Mrs. Paul wiped her tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can't afford to pay for his education right now. My husband is abroad, but we've not heard from him in a long while. I don't have much, but I can't bear to see Ken suffer." Mrs. Dan stood up and placed a reassuring hand on Mrs. Paul's shoulder. "You don't need to worry about money. I'll teach Ken free of charge. Every child deserves a chance, and I believe with patience, Ken will learn." Mrs. Paul broke down in tears, overwhelmed by Mrs. Dan's kindness. "Thank you, Ma, thank you so much." Mrs. Dan smiled. "You are welcome, Ma," she replied. Sarah, who had been watching the conversation, walked over to Ken and smiled. "My name is Sarah. Do you want to play with me outside while our mothers talk?" Ken hesitated for a moment but then nodded. As the two children ran off to play, Mrs. Paul looked at Mrs. Dan with gratitude in her eyes. "You don't know how much this means to us." Mrs. Dan smiled. "I'm just doing what I believe is right." She pauses. "I also believe in obtaining God's help while we do our best. Can we make an agreement prayer for Ken?" Mrs. Paul agreed and they prayed. After the prayer, Mrs. Paul felt a wave of peace. It has been a long time she prayed last. She told Mrs. Dan that she will start praying concerning everything including her marriage and her husband's reconnection to her and her son. Teaching Ken wasn't easy at first. He struggled to understand even the simplest lessons, and his confidence was shattered from the bullying he had experienced at schools he attended earlier. But Mrs. Dan was patient. Day after day, she worked with Ken, finding new ways to explain concepts and encouraging him every step of the way. She also prayed with Ken and Sarah every day before their lessons for each day start. Sarah, too, played a part in Ken's growth. The two children became fast friends, and Sarah's warmth helped Ken feel accepted. Over time, Ken began to make progress. His once timid nature gave way to curiosity, and he started learning in ways no one had expected. Everyone was elated. Mrs. Paul expressed her gratitude each time she came to drop Ken at Mrs. Dan's house. By the end of the holiday, Mrs. Paul visited Mrs. Dan to express her gratitude. Ken has changed so much since he started learning with you, Mrs. Paul said, her voice filled with emotion. He's happier now. He's learning. I don't know how to thank you. Mrs. Dan smiled. It's mostly Ken's hard work. He just needed someone to believe in him. I'm glad he's making a lot of progress. Mrs. Paul sighed deeply. There's something I need to tell you. Ken's father, he's finally contacted us last night. He said he was wrongly accused and imprisoned earlier but free now. We'll be traveling abroad soon to join him, but first we will be traveling to the village. Thank you for sharing your light. Thank you for teaching me the importance of asking for divine assistance from God through prayer. Indeed, prayer works. Tears filled Mrs. Dan's eyes, and she embraced Mrs. Paul warmly. I'm so happy for both of you. Ken is going to do great things. Amen, Mrs. Paul replied. They talked for a while. As Mrs. Paul and Ken prepared to leave, Sarah hugged her friend tightly. I'm going to miss you, Ken. I'll miss you too, Sarah, Ken replied, his voice soft but filled with emotion. The two children are teary-eyed. They hugged one last time before Ken and his mother left for their house. Mrs. Paul and her son Ken traveled abroad to join Ken's father. The family were happily reunited. However, while unpacking her bags and boxes, Mrs. Paul discovered she had lost Mrs. Dan's telephone number. She was quite sad, but there was nothing she could do about it as she didn't have any other means of getting the phone number back. She concentrated on making up for lost time with her husband. Few years later, Mrs. Dan developed a severe form of peptic ulcer accompanied with bleeding. They tried to control it with drugs and lifestyle adjustments. Though it didn't get better as the years went by, this never stopped Mrs. Dan from teaching some street children who couldn't afford tuition for free. She continued doing good for people, but shortly the pain and discomfort increased and she could no longer work as hard as she used to. This made Sarah decide to start hawking orange fruit so they can make ends meet. Mrs. Dan's heart broke into pieces seeing her daughter work at such early age instead of concentrating on her studies. When Sarah was 26 years old, life was even more hard for them. Sarah had grown into a beautiful young woman, but their financial situation had worsened. Mrs. Dan's health condition had deteriorated. They were told at the local hospital that the only corrective measure to control the bleeding and hole caused by the ulcer was surgery. Unfortunately, they had no money to pay for the surgery. Their landlord, Mr. Gooder, was a wealthy but arrogant man who took advantage of his tenants. He saw Sarah's beauty and tried to manipulate her in exchange for their rent. You know how you can solve this, Sarah, Mr. Gooder sneered one day, standing at their door. Just say yes, and I'll take care of all your problems. Sarah clenched her fist, her heart racing with anger. I will never compromise my integrity, Mr. Gooder. I may be struggling, but I'll find a way to pay. Mr. Gooder's face twisted with rage. We'll see how long you can keep that attitude. Your mother's health is failing, and you don't have time. He stormed off, leaving Sarah trembling with frustration. Sarah walked back inside her house. She glanced at her sick mother, lying in bed, barely able to move. Mrs. Dan's once strong and nurturing presence had faded. Sarah knew she had to do something real quick to save her mother.